I woke up to my neighbor Karen screaming, her face redder than a fire hydrant about to explode. The best part? Her luxury SUV was trapped in the middle of a massive trench I'd legally dug around my driveway, complete with a fully functional medieval drawbridge I could raise at will. Her eye was twitching so violently I thought it might pop out of her socket. How did a regular homeowner end up building a fortress to battle the HOA queen? It all started 2 weeks ago. Back then, I was just a regular guy who wanted to live in peace and maybe grill some steaks on the weekend. But peace was impossible with an HOA president who treated our neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. Karen was the type who measured your grass with a ruler, fined you for the wrong shade of beige on your shutters, and sent threatening letters if your car had a speck of dirt. The trouble started when I found Karen's oversized SUV blocking my driveway. As I approached, she stood there with arms crossed, wearing that smug expression reserved for making people miserable. "Your car's blocking my driveway," I said, trying to stay civil. She smiled like a cat watching a trapped mouse. "I know. We've had complaints about your driveway. Until we conduct a proper review, my vehicle stays here to prevent further infractions." I looked at my driveway. A perfectly normal concrete slab, nothing fancy, certainly not breaking any rules. "That's ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with it." "Well," Karen said, inspecting her nails like she was bored with my mere existence, "unfortunately the HOA board has the final say. Oh, and I should mention, if you try to tow my car, that'll be considered harassment. HOA rules." I wanted to argue, yell, do something, but I knew Karen thrived on confrontation. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could slap me with more fines. So instead, I took a deep breath, nodded, and walked back inside. Little did she know, her car blocking was just the beginning of a neighborhood war that would end with sirens, handcuffs, and her complete humiliation. The next few days were hell. Every morning I woke up to find Karen's car still blocking my driveway. The HOA refused to help, and when I called a tow company, they refused, citing some vague community agreement. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around like she owned not just my property but my soul. Then came the fines. Apparently I was being penalized for neglecting driveway maintenance. According to the HOA, my failure to use it because, it was blocked, was grounds for an infraction. Every time I checked my mailbox, there was a fresh letter demanding payment. Every morning, seeing her car in my driveway felt like a boot on my neck. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about whether one person could bully an entire neighborhood into submission. I wasn't the kind of guy to roll over and take it. If Karen wanted to play dirty with HOA rules, I was about to discover the one thing she never expected. I could play dirtier. I spent the next few nights doing what I did best: research. If the HOA was going to weaponize its rules, I was going to find my own legal loophole. After hours of digging through zoning laws and property codes, I found it. A single line in the local ordinances that changed everything. It turned out there were no regulations against making security modifications to private property, as long as it wasn't a permanent structure. I triple-checked and even called a lawyer friend to confirm it was airtight. That's when the real fun began. The next day I rented an excavator, hired a few guys from a construction crew, and told them I wanted a deep, wide trench around my driveway. Not a little ditch, full-on medieval-style moat. They thought I was crazy, but hey, money talks. By the time the sun set, my driveway was surrounded by a 4-foot-deep trench, wide enough that no car could cross it. The next morning, Karen stormed over, ready to gloat. But the moment she saw her SUV stranded in the middle of the trench, her expression went from smug to sheer horror. Her jaw dropped so far I thought it might unhinge like a snake. "What the hell is this?" she screeched, her voice reaching a pitch that probably killed all the neighborhood's bats. "Oh, just some security modifications," I said, barely suppressing my grin as I sipped my morning coffee. "HOA rules say I can do it." Karen's eye twitched. "You can't just dig a hole around my car." "Sure I can. You see, this is my property. And since you refuse to move, well, I had no choice but to build around you." She looked like her brain was short-circuiting. "You can't. This is illegal." "Nope." I pulled out a printout of the zoning laws. Totally legal. In fact, I even filed a permit, city approved. Karen's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack into dust. "You're going to regret this. The HOA will not allow this." I shrugged. "Guess we'll see." I walked back inside, leaving her standing there fuming. The best part? I wasn't done yet. The trench was just the beginning. If Karen thought this was over, she was in for the shock of her life, because I had just started designing the drawbridge. The next morning, I woke up to furious banging on my front door. Karen was standing there, looking like she had spent the night plotting my destruction. Her hair frizzed out like she'd stuck her finger in an electrical socket. "You need to fill that hole in right now," she seethed, practically spitting the words. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the way her eye twitched at my lack of urgency. "Oh, you mean the trench? Sorry, can't do that. It's a legal security measure." Karen let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a screech. "You have exactly 24 hours to fix this, or I will make sure the HOA fines you into oblivion." I pretended to think about it. "You know, that's interesting, because I was about to make some more improvements." She narrowed her eyes. "What kind of improvements?" I grinned. "A drawbridge." Her mouth opened, then closed again like a fish gasping for air. She looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "You can't just put a drawbridge in a suburban neighborhood," she sputtered, her face turning a shade of purple I didn't think was humanly possible. "Sure I can. Already checked the regulations. As long as it's a temporary structure and not a permanent gate, I can build it. And since you're so concerned about my driveway, this will help keep it protected." The trench was satisfying, but what came next would turn our quiet suburb into an internet sensation overnight. I spent days gathering materials and hiring skilled contractors, not just for proof I was following regulations, but because I knew this would be internet gold. As construction continued, Karen escalated her attacks. She called in city inspectors, who left shaking their heads when they saw everything was perfectly legal. She tried organizing a petition, but most neighbors were just as sick of her as I was. With each failed attempt to stop me, her face grew redder, her threats more desperate. By the time the drawbridge was fully installed, the whole neighborhood was watching. It was a thing of beauty, a sturdy wooden platform controlled by a simple pulley system that allowed me to raise and lower it whenever I pleased. I gave it a test run, pulling the rope and watching with satisfaction as the bridge lifted, leaving my driveway completely inaccessible. Karen, of course, lost her mind. "This is insane. You can't have a medieval fortress in the middle of the neighborhood," she screamed, stomping her foot like a toddler denied candy. "It's not a fortress, it's a security feature," I said, maintaining my calm. "You know, for protecting my property, HOA rules encourage security improvements." She let out a strangled noise and stomped away. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Later that night, I was woken up by the sound of rustling outside. I peeked through my blinds and saw Karen creeping around the edge of my trench with a flashlight. She was inspecting the drawbridge, probably looking for a way to sabotage it. I grabbed my phone and started recording. "Looking for something, Karen?" I called out. She whirled around, nearly losing her balance and falling into the trench. "I was just making sure this ridiculous thing isn't a hazard." "You mean trespassing? Because that's what it looks like to me." She scowled but quickly composed herself. "I'm on the HOA board. I have the right to inspect potential violations. That's funny because last time I checked, the HOA doesn't own my property. But don't worry, I'll be sending this video to my lawyer, and maybe even posting it online. I'm sure the internet would love to see the HOA president sneaking around private property in the middle of the night." Her face drained of color, and without another word, she turned and hurried back to her house, tripping over her own feet in her rush to escape. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had spread about Karen's midnight snooping and people were starting to turn against her. She tried to spin it, claiming she was just doing her job, but no one was buying it. Meanwhile, my story was gaining traction online. The video of the trench and drawbridge had gone viral, with thousands of comments praising me for standing up to HOA tyranny. People were sending me messages of support from all over the country. Karen must have realized she was losing ground because she switched tactics. If she couldn't beat me with rules, she was going to make my life miserable in other ways. The fines kept coming, ridiculous ones like unauthorized modifications to property and creating an unsightly structure. She even convinced a few of her remaining HOA loyalists to file noise complaints, despite the fact that construction had already ended. But I was ready for her. I had been quietly gathering evidence of her abuse of power, including records of her misusing HOA funds for personal expenses. It wasn't hard to find. Turns out she wasn't nearly as careful with paperwork as she was with enforcing her petty rules. I compiled everything into a neat little folder, ready to strike when the time was right. The final showdown came during an emergency HOA meeting that Karen had called to discuss my so-called violations. The moment I walked in, I could tell she thought she had won. She sat at the head of the table with a smug smile, ready to deliver her verdict. "We've decided that your modifications are in violation of the community standards," she announced with the gravitas of a judge sentencing a criminal. "You'll need to remove them immediately, or you will be facing legal action." I smiled, pulling out my folder and placing it on the table with a dramatic thud that made everyone jump. That's interesting, because I've found some violations. She frowned. What are you talking about? I opened the folder and started listing her misdeeds, fraudulent fines, misuse of HOA funds, intimidation tactics against homeowners. The more I read, the paler she got until she looked like a ghost in a pantsuit. You're lying, she hissed, but her voice had lost its usual authority. I have proof, I said, sliding documents across the table, and I'm willing to take this to the authorities. Silence filled the room. The other board members, most of whom had been too scared to stand up to her before, suddenly looked very interested in what I had to say. Within minutes, Karen was voted out as HOA president. By the end of the week, an investigation into her shady dealings had begun. That night, I stood on my driveway, sipping a cold drink as I watched Karen's SUV finally being towed away, not by me, but by the authorities. I thought I'd won, but Karen had one desperate move left, one that would spectacularly backfire and seal her fate forever. Karen was quiet for a few days after the HOA meeting, which was unsettling in itself. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I knew she was brewing something. Sure enough, the storm came. It started small, a sudden anonymous report to the city about unpermitted construction, a surprise inspection from a zoning official, who looked both amused and annoyed when he saw my drawbridge. He shrugged, gave me a nod, and left after confirming I was in the clear. Then came the fake complaints from neighbors, loud noises in the middle of the night, suspicious activity, even claims that my trench was a safety hazard that could cause structural instability in the neighborhood. I knew exactly who was behind it, but without solid proof, it was just another game of harassment. Then Karen took it up a notch. One night, I woke up to a loud crash. My heart pounded as I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. At first, I didn't see anything, but when I turned on the outdoor lights, my stomach dropped. Someone had cut the ropes to my drawbridge. It lay half-collapsed into the trench. The wooden planks cracked from the impact. I grabbed my phone and checked the security cameras. There she was, Karen, dressed in all black like a low-budget ninja, wielding bolt cutters. She had actually climbed into my trench and sabotaged the mechanism herself. This wasn't petty HOA enforcement anymore, this was criminal. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, Karen had fled back to her house, but the footage told the whole story. The officers knocked on her door, and after a few minutes, she was dragged outside, still screaming about how she was the victim. As they handcuffed her and placed her in the back of the police cruiser, our neighbors began appearing on their porches, some openly cheering. Years of HOA tyranny had just collapsed like my sabotage drawbridge. The neighborhood exploded with gossip the next day. It turned out Karen had been pissing off people for years, but no one had dared to stand up to her until now. Some neighbors admitted they had wanted to fight back but were afraid of retaliation. Now that she had been publicly humiliated, the HOA board had no choice but to take action. They held an emergency vote to remove her from the HOA entirely, stripping her of any remaining power. It was a unanimous decision, but that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, I received an email from an investigator handling HOA fraud cases. Apparently, Karen's financial misdeeds had caught the attention of authorities. They wanted to interview me about the files I had presented during the meeting. I handed over everything, every fine she had wrongfully issued, every shady financial transaction I had uncovered. Within a week, the investigation turned into a full-blown legal case. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a full-on scam artist. She had been skimming HOA funds for years, using them to fund personal vacations, luxury purchases, and even some suspicious offshore accounts. When the news broke, the neighborhood lost its mind. People who had once feared her were now openly mocking her. Some even put up free at last banners on their houses. Her house went up for sale shortly after. It sat on the market longer than usual because, well, no one wanted to buy the former dictator's residence. Eventually, she had no choice but to sell at a loss and leave town. The day she moved out, I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching as she loaded the last of her things into a moving truck. She shot me one last glare, but there was no power behind it anymore. She had lost. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast as the truck pulled away. With Karen gone, the HOA board crumbled. Most of the remaining members resigned, and the neighborhood voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Turned out people were happier without it. No more ridiculous rules, no more fines, no more fear of stepping out of line. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. As for me, I became a local legend. The story of the trench and drawbridge spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets picked it up, and before I knew it, I was being interviewed about my brilliant act of defiance. My videos went viral, and people from all over the world wanted to know more. Some even sent fan mail asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA nightmares. The drawbridge, now fully repaired, became a permanent feature. Kids in the neighborhood loved it, calling my house Castle Jake. I even installed a small plaque at the edge of the trench that read, "In memory of HOA tyranny." It became not just a conversation piece, but a monument to standing up against petty power. One evening, as I was grilling steaks in my backyard, one of my neighbors stopped by. He was an older guy who had lived here longer than anyone, and had seen Karen's reign from the beginning. "You know," he said, watching the sun set over our now peaceful neighborhood, "I always thought someone would take her down eventually, but I never imagined it would happen with a trench and drawbridge." I laughed. "Sometimes you have to get creative." He grinned, raising his beer in a toast. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. This place is better without her." I nodded, flipping the steaks. "Yeah, it is. And for the first time since I moved in, I actually felt at home. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's winning spectacularly."